I'm going to talk about BEAD, Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. This is the bread and butter of what we've been talking about. This is our large infrastructure program. The federal government is investing $40 billion, and it's going to be coming through states. So the way it'll work is Wisconsin will get an allocation from the federal government, and then we will work very similar to our existing grant program to allocate that money to projects and areas in need and make sure that we can get access to everyone. This slide, I'm stealing these slides from NTIA, which is our cohort agency at the federal level, part of the U.S. Department of Commerce. And so thank you and credit to them. But there's a lot on here, and I'm sure we'll make sure these slides are available if you want to study them more. But I'll just briefly talk through one thing here for BEAD. Is the timeline, I think, is really important, and everyone's anxious to get going. But I just want to talk you through, what needs to get done for us to build that infrastructure and where we are right now. So it's a little small, but I think I would say first and foremost, the funding was announced as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law last fall, and since that time we've been working and planning with NTIA and the U.S. Department of Commerce to develop a planning process and understand what allocation of funding will look like in Wisconsin. So just last week, I can happily say we successfully submitted our application for our state's portion of BEAD funding. We're hopeful, and there's some variables there, but we're hopeful that Wisconsin will get around $1 billion to allocate for broadband infrastructure development. So right now, we submitted an application for planning. Once it's approved, we'll spend about 9 months planning and working with New North and other economic development partners, local communities, local municipalities, counties, to develop a strategy, get good data, understand the needs and wants of communities, and find out what works best in the most accountable, efficient, and expeditious way. So we're going to spend the next 9 months or so, 10 months or so, developing a plan. Once that plan's in place, we will submit it to the federal government. They'll review it for make sure we're hitting all the things we need to, and then we'll start with the process where we'll start developing our program to allocate funding, and that can be about a 4 or 5 year implementation. We'll be giving out grants to serve locations and working with all the providers and local partners to actually build that infrastructure and put it in the ground. So that's BEAD at a very high level, but I can keep going. You want to go to the next slide, please? So taking a step back before I drown you in timelines, BEAD is focused first and foremost on infrastructure deployment. And right here we've got 3 ranked categories here. This is the prioritization criteria that the federal government has given us in how we allocate our BEAD funding. So first and foremost, we are going to be identifying and serving locations in Wisconsin, every physical address that lacks service to 25/3 service. And part of that strategy is going to be identifying those locations, but first and foremost, we're going to be serving 25/3. If funding allows, and this is an open question, we'll move our way down the list, providing service to folks who lack 100 by 20, and eventually making sure any community anchor institutions are getting their gigabit connections. So next slide, please. That's the big picture, but what are we doing right now? Well, right now we're in our planning phase, and a big component of our planning phase is working with our data and working with our maps. And August is a great partner and a great collaborator on that effort, but working to develop an understanding of where that service is and where it needs to be. First and foremost, I should step back. The BEAD program, the allocation of funding, that $1 billion that Wisconsin is planning on getting, is going to be based on a determination by the Federal Communications Commission. That's kind of our federal agency counterpart at PSC. They're conducting a nationwide effort to develop a location-based map of broadband service. We've talked about a little bit earlier this morning. Traditionally, the best we had for a map of broadband service is at the census tract level, and it's not good enough. If one house in that census tract has service, then we call that area served, and there are folks who are left out. So we're upgrading our data strategy. We're getting a location by location, address by address map of whether or not we have service. And once we have that map, Wisconsin's going to get its proportional amount of all the unserved locations in the state, in the country, and that we hope will be about $1 billion. It could be a little more, it could be a little less. But once that's approved by FCC, we'll move forward in actually allocating that money. But before we do, alongside our data strategy, we're conducting a 9-month, 10-month long planning process here. You'll see up here the number 5 million. That's the amount of money the federal government has given us or will be giving us once our application is hopefully approved in the near future here to conduct a planning process. And there's a bunch of bullet points up here of all the things we want to do in our planning process. I could talk for days about each of these, but I think some of the really big ones we already talked about. Data collection is a huge component. Doing outreach and publications, holding events like this, to educate folks on what we're doing, but also to hear from communities about what they need, meeting with county administrators and providers and looking for partnerships and ways we can work together to find the most efficient, cost-effective, accountable, build-out and expeditious build-out of broadband. So, in our planning process, we're going to be doing all of these things, and certainly alongside that, and we heard about this too, finding ways to provide toolkits and skills and seminars and capacities to our local units of government, to our Jessicas, to our county administrators, to all of our different members and stakeholders, so that they feel comfortable and empowered to step up and say, we need broadband in our community and we know how to get started. So, all of those will be components of our strategy, our 5-year of a 5-year plan that we'll put together. And once we have that 5-year plan finalized, we'll start building it and implementing it. So next slide, please. So, most of all, and this slide is a great representation of all the different ways that we're going to be doing outreach, and we would love to hear from you. We will keep pestering you these next 9 and 10 months until we hear from you. We want to work with you and know what you need and how you want to plan your broadband. So, we're going to be looking for geographic coverage. We're going to be looking for a broad set of stakeholders, not just providers, not just counties, but communities and schools and libraries and all these different users of the internet, and our workforce, our private sector partners, our businesses who depend on good broadband. We're going to be talking to all these different stakeholder groups and bringing them together to make sure that we have a really complex, robust plan that's comprehensive. So that's local coordination. That's BEAD. Next slide, please. Once we do all that, we'll have our 5-year plan, and you can read these slides later, but these are all the things that we have to make sure we cover in our 5-year plan, and there's a mountain of them. So we're working to pull all those pieces together so that it can make sure that we have a plan that works and is efficient for everyone. So next slide, please. Thank you. So, taking a step back, that's BEAD. That's our infrastructure deployment program. That's the bread and butter of a lot of our broadband efforts. This is another way to look at our timeline. Right now, if you look up there, we're in kind of the planning phase. We are working with our federal partner, U.S. Department of Commerce, NTIA, to get our application for planning funds approved. And hopefully, we don't know the exact timeline, but hopefully maybe by October, we will get that $5 million of planning funds, and then we will hit the ground running to do that outreach, build those toolkits, get that data strategy, do all those components of our BEAD strategy so that we can be ready to go in spring, next summer, when we start talking about actually allocating that infrastructure dollars. So that's BEAD. That's our biggest component.